The chair scraped back from the table with a sound that seemed too loud for a Wednesday afternoon, and Lena Whitfield set down her pen without looking at her husband. She had used that pen to sign her name to a stack of documents her attorney had prepared over the previous 3 weeks, and she placed it back beside the water glass with the deliberate calm of someone who had finished a task she had been planning for a long time. Across the table, Marcus Webb sat with his hands in his lap and said nothing. His attorney, a compact man in a gray suit whose name Marcus had already forgotten twice, gathered the papers into a leather folder and did not make eye contact with either of them. Lena let her gaze settle on Marcus once, the way you look at a piece of furniture you've decided to donate. Not unkind, just done. She would keep the house on Elm Grove Drive, the joint accounts, and the car she had picked out herself. She had been reasonable, her attorney had assured the room, which was a word that could mean almost anything depending on who was using it. Marcus would keep his personal savings, his truck, and a custody arrangement that gave him alternating weekends and every other Tuesday. Every other Tuesday, as though fatherhood were a standing lunch appointment that could be rescheduled when something more important came up. He did not argue, he did not plead. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, looked once at their daughter Maisie's crayon drawing that had somehow ended up in his coat pocket that morning, and walked out of the conference room into a Portland afternoon that smelled like rain. Everyone in that room assumed they had just watched a man fold. The story had not started in that conference room. It had started 4 years earlier, in a rented garage on the east side of Portland that Marcus Webb used as a workshop after Maisie went to sleep. He was 39, a Finnish carpenter by trade, which meant he spent his days building things for other people's houses, and his evenings building something no one had thought to ask about. By day, he showed up at job sites with his tools and his tape measure and his reputation, which was quieter than his work and more reliable. He took the contracts that paid and turned down the ones that ran too long into evening. Maisie's school pickup was not negotiable. She was 8 when this started. She had a gap between her front teeth and a habit of narrating everything she did in the third person, as though her own life were a documentary she found genuinely interesting. She needed someone to pack her lunch and remember which days were early release and understand that the blue water bottle was the correct water bottle, and that the green one might as well not exist, that someone was Marcus. Lena had moved fast in the years since Maisie was born. She was a product director at a mid-sized design firm, the kind of woman who walked into a meeting and restructured it in the first 4 minutes. She was good at her work in a way that had once made Marcus proud and had later made him careful about what he said at her company dinners. There was always a small pause before the word carpenter. She had not become cruel. It was more precise than that. She had simply recalibrated what she found useful, and Marcus had not made the list. The night, she told him, felt to Marcus like a thing that had been decided long before it was said. She came home a little past 7, poured herself a glass of water at the sink, and told him she wanted to separate. Her voice had the practiced steadiness of someone who had rehearsed it to the point where the words felt like facts. She had already been in touch with an attorney, she said. There was no cruelty in the way she said it, just efficiency. Marcus stood at the kitchen island and understood 2 things at once. The first was that the decision was old, and he was the last to be informed of it. The second was the name he had been hearing for several months at the edge of conversations Lena no longer bothered to leave the room for. Donovan Reese, introduced once as a colleague from the San Francisco office. The kind of name that appears too often to mean nothing. He did not say it. He folded a dish towel along its crease and set it on the counter and thought about what came next, which was Maisie, who was asleep down the hall with her left arm over the edge of the bed the way she always slept, reaching for something even in the dark. The custody proposal her attorney sent over arrived 4 days later. It was written in the language of careful professionals, which is to say it was devastating in a way that left no fingerprints. Marcus was described throughout as a loving presence whose financial instability and non-traditional employment made him unsuitable as a primary custodian. He had no salary. He had no employer. He had no fixed contract a court could point to and say, "This man has a plan." What he had was a truck and a set of tools and a little girl who asked for him by name when she woke up from bad dreams. On paper, they were right. He understood that. The invisible work of parenting left no records a judge could hold. He considered surrender the way any exhausted person considers it, as the shape of least resistance, a path that costs nothing up front and everything later. 2 weekends a month, every other Tuesday, he could absorb it. He was good at absorbing things. The thing that made it impossible arrived on a Friday night at the end of a long week. He had finished the bedtime routine, the teeth, the water, the specific stuffed rabbit that lived in a specific corner of the bed and could not be relocated under any circumstances, and he was sitting on the edge of Maisie's mattress in the dim light from the hallway when she reached up with both hands and took hold of his wrist the way she did when she wanted his full attention. "Dad," she said. "Will you still come to my birthday?" She said it the way she asked everything, plainly, with the same matter-of-fact curiosity she brought to questions about dinosaurs and why clouds had edges. But it hit Marcus somewhere below the ribs and stayed. "Yeah, Bug," he said, and his voice did not waver. "Every single one. Promise?" "Promise." She let go of his wrist and turned toward her rabbit and was asleep in 4 minutes with the loose, total confidence of someone who had been told the truth. Marcus sat there in the dark after her breathing had gone slow and deep and thought about what it meant to make a promise to a person who had no reason not to believe you completely. He thought about every birthday after this one, about driving to a house that used to be his to pick her up for alternating weekends, about becoming a visitor in his daughter's life. He did not sleep much that night, but by morning he had made the only decision that felt like him. He drove to the garage. The thing in the garage was 3 years old by then. Marcus had started it the way he started most things, with a problem that annoyed him enough to fix it. He had spent his career watching Finnish carpenters and furniture makers lose time, money, and clients because the estimating software available to them had been built by people who had never held a piece of wood in their hands. The numbers it produced were wrong in ways that were hard to explain, but immediately obvious to anyone who had spent a decade in the trade. He had complained about it for a year, then started building a replacement. He had no business background, he had no investors. He had his father's old laptop, a set of skills he'd taught himself from library books and online forums, and whatever hours the evenings gave him after Maisie was in bed. He had paid for all of it himself. That had been instinct more than strategy, because Marcus had always kept 2 accounts since the year before the marriage. One joint, one his own, from the sale of a small property his uncle had left him, the servers, the domain, the software licenses, the contractor he'd hired for 3 months to help with the architecture he couldn't figure out alone. All of it came from that account. All of it registered in his name. He had told Lena about the project once, in passing 2 years before the divorce. She had said that sounded interesting and asked if he wanted chicken or pasta for dinner. He had not brought it up again. That morning he called the only attorney whose name had come back from 3 different people he trusted. They all described her the same way, and not warmly, which Marcus had decided was a good sign. Her name was Adrienne Cole. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, and she read the custody proposal once without expression and set it down between them with the flat precision of someone who has read too many of these to be surprised by them. "On paper," she said, "you look like a risk." Marcus nodded. "No salary, no employer, no fixed asset in your name that a court can convert to a number. Her team won't say you're a bad father. That's amateur. They'll say you're an uncertain one, a man whose finances are too loose to build a child's life around." She tapped the page. "They'll be sympathetic about it. That's what makes it hard to answer." "I've been building something," Marcus said, "in the garage." Adrienne looked at him the way she had looked at the document. Without expression, but with her full attention. "Tell me about it. Not what it does, what it cost, who owns it, where the money came from." So, he told her, the account that predated the marriage and had never been touched by it. The payments that came from that account alone. The intellectual property filed in his name at the beginning of the second year, when the thing had become real enough to protect. 3 years of work in the hours that belonged to no one but him. She listened without taking notes. Then she leaned back. "That's more useful than you know," she said. "But understand where we stand. Oregon operates under equitable distribution principles. Property built during a marriage isn't automatically split, but the default leans towards sharing unless you can prove the separation of resources was deliberate and documented. What you've described isn't a defense. It's the raw material for one. My job is to make it a wall before anyone knocks the bricks over." She gave him one instruction before he left: sign the dissolution agreement and nothing else. Not the house, not the custody terms, not the financial settlement. Only the document that said the marriage was ending. "Let them think it's over," she said. "A man who doesn't fight the divorce looks calm. A man who accepts the divorce and then defends everything else looks like he has something real to defend. Right now, they're expecting you to fold on all of it at once. Don't give them the satisfaction of being right." 3 weeks later, Marcus signed the dissolution agreement in the glass conference room, while Maisie slept against his shoulder, too tired from a long afternoon to know where she was. Lena watched him from across the table, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had counted everything in the room and found it satisfactory. He walked out without argument. He let her think whatever she wanted to think. What followed was the kind of pressure that is designed not to feel like pressure. Lena's attorneys supported, Marcus would come to understand, by the institutional resources of a firm whose legal department treated the family case as a line item. Never raised their voices. They asked for a custody evaluation. They framed it as standard. The implication underneath was not standard at all. Can a man who works with his hands and keeps irregular hours and has no employer be trusted as a primary caregiver? The question was unanswerable without sounding defensive, and sounding defensive was the point. Meanwhile, the visitation schedule began to shift. A Saturday was moved to Sunday due to a scheduling conflict that was never explained. A full weekend was canceled because Maisie had a stomachache, though when Marcus called she sounded fine, and asked why he hadn't come yet. He documented every instance. He did not react. He called Adrian after each one and gave her the dates and the language Lena had used and went back to the garage. The thing that changed the shape of arrived on a Tuesday morning in Adrian's office, delivered in a single sentence, in her measured, unhurried voice. "Marcus, someone has contacted us about your software." He went still. "A development group out of Chicago. They specialize in niche trade verticals, the kind of tools that serve specific industries nobody else is building for. They've been using your public repository for about 6 months, apparently. They sent a formal inquiry last week." She turned her monitor toward him. "Their opening valuation is preliminary, but it's in the 7-figure range." Marcus sat with it. "Did you solicit this?" "No." His voice came out quieter than he intended. "I put the core framework on a public repository to test it, see if the logic held up when real people looked at it. I never sent it to anyone." Adrienne was watching him with an attention that had gone sharp in a way he recognized. She pulled up a second document on her screen, then a third. "I want you to think about timing," she said. Lena filed for dissolution on a specific date. I have the early correspondence between her attorney and her firm's legal department, and now I have an inquiry from a Chicago group. She set the third document beside the others. There is a connection between Donovan Reese and the senior partner at the development group's legal representation. Loose, but traceable. She knew about the software? She knew something. I can't tell you how much, not yet, but the dissolution moved faster than these things usually move. She was not reacting slowly to a marriage that had run its course. She moved with an urgency that's easier to explain if she understood she was working against a clock. Marcus sat in the chair across from Adrian's desk and felt the floor of the story he had been telling himself tilt and settle into a different shape entirely. He had been carrying himself like a man absorbing an unfair loss. The good carpenter who had done the invisible work, who got up every morning and packed the lunch and drove the route and was being discarded because he could not be introduced at company dinners without a pause. He had pitied himself a little in the middle of been quietly evenings in the garage. But that was not the story. Lena had not left him because he was going nowhere. She had left because she had seen enough to know he was about to arrive somewhere, and she wanted a clean exit before the arrival became an asset she would have to share. He was not a husband being set aside. He was a position being closed before it paid out. The pity left him like air from a room, and something steadier and colder settled in behind it. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Adrian agreed. The pressure shifted when Lena understood he wasn't going to accept the terms. It did not arrive as aggression. It arrived as fog. Through Donovan Reese and the social infrastructure of people who moved in the same investment circles, a quiet uncertainty began to circulate around the Chicago group's inquiry. Questions without sources. Was the ownership structure clean? Was the founder mid-litigation? Were there complicating factors a serious buyer would want to wait out? The effect was the same as it would have been if someone had dropped the questions into a conversation at the right moment, which, Adrian suspected, was exactly what had happened. Then Lena came to him in person. Marcus had taken a sublet on Fairmount Street for the duration, 2 rooms and a kitchen with a window that looked out on someone else's fire escape. Maisie had the bedroom. Marcus slept on the fold-out sofa and told her it was like camping, which she accepted as a reasonable explanation, because at 8 you still extend that kind of grace to the adults around you. It was a Tuesday night, after Maisie was asleep. A knock at the door, and Lena standing in the hallway in a coat Marcus didn't recognize, with the expression of someone who had made calculations on the way over, and arrived confident in their accuracy. He let her in because Maisie was sleeping, and because the conversation on the doorstep felt wrong. She did not sit down. She looked around the apartment with something that was not contempt. Softer than that, more damaging, a species of pity. And then she made her offer. She had clearly practiced it. It was good. He would smoothing a settlement. He would accept a generous support arrangement and step back from the custody fight. In exchange, she would lift the quiet pressure on the Chicago group. The inquiry would proceed. The valuation would close. He would come out of it with money and without a war. "You're a better father than you'll ever be a businessman," she said, and her voice was almost kind. "That's not an insult, Marcus. It's just the truth. Don't walk into rooms you weren't built to stand in." He looked at her for a long moment, at the woman he had married when they were both nobody much, who had counted every card before she laid them down. "Go home, Lena," he said, and held the door. She studied him for a beat too long, the way someone looks at a calculation that isn't coming out the way it should. Then she went. Her footsteps were quiet on the stairs, and then the outer door opened and closed, and the apartment settled back into its ordinary silence. Marcus stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the fire escape and felt for the first time the actual weight of what he had set in motion. Not the legal machinery of it. He had made peace with the legal machinery. It was the other thing. The fact that Maisie was 8, and that 8-year-olds remember things, and that whatever happened in the next few months would become part of the architecture of her ordinary life. He wondered whether the right answer was to win or to be there. Whether gambling the second in pursuit of the first was something a good father did. He didn't have an answer. He had Adrian and the work and the promise he'd made on the edge of a child's bed in the dark. He went back to the garage. The bottom dropped out 9 days before the hearing. It appeared first as a brief item on a technology trade blog, the kind of post that travels before anyone fact-checks it. The piece described Marcus's estimating platform in terms that were technically adjacent to true and functionally designed to raise questions. It mentioned an ongoing divorce. It used the phrase unresolved ownership dispute, which was not a phrase that existed in any court document, but which would sound very specific and very bad to anyone managing due diligence for a 7-figure acquisition. By the following morning, the Chicago group had requested a pause in the process pending a review of the legal situation. Adrian called at noon. If the court grants the asset freeze, she said, without softening it, the deal stalls and we lose the only concrete evidence of your independent financial standing. We'd be back to their original premise. A man with a truck and some tools fighting for his daughter on terms they've already written. I know. I'm not telling you it's finished. I'm telling you it's the worst moment so far. A pause. There's something else, though. I've spent the last 4 days tracing the blog post, the specific language in it, the phrasing around the ownership dispute, the detail about the timing of the dissolution. That information doesn't exist in any public filing. It was in 2 places, your wife's legal team and Donovan Reese. Marcus stood at the window of the Fairmount Street sublet and looked at the fire escape. Someone handed that post to the writer, Adrian said. I can show you the hand it came from. Show the court, he said. That, she said, and he heard something in her voice he hadn't heard before. The sound of a person who has been building a wall 1 brick at a time and can finally see the top of it is exactly what I intend to do. The morning of the hearing was gray and flat, the sky the color of concrete, doing nothing in particular. Marcus had laid out his clothes the night before and packed Maisie's bag for 2 nights at her grandmother's and crouched at the door to button her coat and promised he would be back by dinner, which was a specific promise about a specific meal. Then he stood on the sidewalk in front of the Fairmount building and waited, because Adrian had told him only that someone would come, and that he should let them. The car that arrived was a silver Audi, low and clean, and the man behind the wheel was someone Marcus knew by reputation only. His name was Patrick Odom, the principal behind the Chicago group that had been circling the platform for 7 months. He was in his mid-50s and had the unhurried manner of a person who had stopped having to prove things some years ago. Marcus had assumed, in the way you assume things about people who write 7-figure checks, that they sent people to handle the moments like this. Odom leaned across and pushed the door open. You're going to want to be early, he said. Early is yours to own. Late belongs to whoever's already in the room. Marcus got in. For the first few blocks, Odom said nothing. Just let the city go by. One of my analysts has been pulling your framework apart for 4 months, he said eventually. Keep sending me notes about it. Sent me the same note 3 times that it was built by someone who had actually done the work, not someone who read about the work. He glanced over. You'd didn't pitch me. You didn't send a deck. You didn't show up in my inbox with a warm intro from someone I'd feel obligated to take a meeting for. That's almost impossible to do accidentally. A few blocks from the courthouse, Odom pulled to the curb and put the car in park. Then he did something Marcus didn't expect. He got out, came around to the driver's side and held the door. You take it from here, Odom said. I'll walk in, but it should be you behind the wheel. Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. And it won't hurt for certain people to see who they're dealing with. Marcus understood the shape of it, the practical kindness folded inside the strategy. He slid behind the wheel. The courthouse steps were full when the Audi pulled around the corner. A local technology blogger had picked up the acquisition story 2 days earlier, and a divorce tangled with a 7-figure trade software deal had attracted the kind of attention that assembles itself without being invited. Lena's lead attorney was on the steps with a stack of files under one arm. Donovan Reese stood near the entrance with his hands in his pockets. The posture of a man who had come to watch something be concluded. The door opened and Marcus Webb stepped out. He was not wearing anything remarkable. He had his good jacket and his work hands and the specific stillness of a man who had spent 3 years building something in a garage at midnight and had not told a single person what it was worth. Patrick Odom stepped out of the passenger side a moment later and buttoned his jacket, and didn't say anything. That was the detail that traveled. The reporters who recognized the name began to murmur it, and the murmur moved up the steps like a current through still water. Lena was already inside. Donovan Reese was not. Marcus did not look at him for long. Just long enough to watch the arithmetic move behind his eyes, the sudden recalculation of someone who has understood that the board has a piece on it he hadn't been told about. Then Marcus walked up the steps and through the doors and into a room that had already decided the outcome, and that was about to find out it had been wrong. Inside, Adrian was already at the table, her files organized in the precise way of someone who has thought about the order twice and is done thinking about it. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with the patient, unsurprised face of someone who had watched a great many people perform certainty in front of her and had learned to wait for the part that came after. Lena's team led first. They were good. They had done this before. A devoted but uncertain father, non-traditional employment, financial instability, a mother positioned to provide the child with structure, stability, a foundation built on something a court could measure. Then Adrian stood up, and she did not raise her voice once. She began with dates. She laid out the timeline of the dissolution, when Lena had first contacted her attorney, when the early correspondence between that attorney and Lena's firm's legal department had occurred, and alongside it, when the Chicago Group's analyst had first accessed the public repository and flagged it internally. The two lines ran beside each other on the record, like a question that answered itself. Lena had not been surprised by Marcus's project and reacted. She had moved ahead of it, racing to finalize terms before the asset surfaced and became something she would have to share openly in front of a judge. The petitioner did not learn about this project late, Adrian said in the even tone of someone reading a calendar aloud. She learned about it early, and the structure and timing of this proceeding were built around reaching a settlement before it could be valued. Lena's attorney objected to the characterization. The judge allowed Adrian to continue. Then came the blog post. Adrian produced the reconstruction of its origin, the path from specific legal language that existed in only two informed minds to a trade blogger who had no clear reason to have it, to a post timed precisely to coincide with the due diligence window of the Chicago Group. The disruption of the acquisition process, Adrian said, was not market caution. It was engineered, and it was engineered by a party acting in coordination with the petitioner. A change moved through the room. Lena's attorneys began to have the quiet, urgent conversations of a team discovering that part of its foundation was not solid. Through the narrow window in the courtroom door, Marcus caught a glimpse of Donovan Reese standing in the hallway for a moment, then turning and walking away without looking back. He did not reappear. Adrian closed on the asset question methodically, the way you build a wall, one documented brick at a time, the account that predated the marriage by 2 years, the payments that had never touched the joint finances, the IP registration in Marcus's name, executed in the second year of the project, the work performed after a household had gone to sleep, funded by a separate account built by one pair of hands. Oregon did not begin from community property assumptions, but Adrian acknowledged the equitable distribution default plainly and then took it apart piece by piece until the presumption could not hold against the documentation. This was not built with shared funds, she finished. It was not built during shared time. It was not built with shared knowledge. The petitioner's attempt to encumber it is an attempt to claim something that was never part of the shared estate. When she sat down, the room was very quiet. The judge looked at Marcus for a long moment. She set aside her notes and looked at him the way people look at someone when they have heard all the argument they need and want to find the human being underneath it. "Mr. Webb," she said, "set aside the asset question. I want to hear from you, not your attorney. Why do you want primary custody of your daughter?" Marcus stood. He did not reach for the timeline or the platform or the valuation. None of it had been the point. Standing there in the quiet of the room, he had only one thing that was entirely true. "A few weeks ago," he said, "I was putting Maisie to bed the way I do every night, and she reached up and took my wrist and asked me if I was still going to come to her birthday." His voice came out steadier than the feeling behind it. "She was 8. She asked me things like that the same way she asks why birds fly south and what happens to stars in the daytime, like it's just a regular question." He stopped for a moment. "I told her I would. I told her every single one. And she let go of my wrist and went to sleep like she had no reason not to believe me, because she didn't." He looked at the judge. "Everything I've done in the last 90 days, I did because I made her that promise. I don't want primary custody because of what I built in that garage. I want it because I'm the one who has been there, and I don't ever want to be the reason the answer to that question is no." No one said anything for a moment. The judge looked at him a beat longer, then wrote something down, and the silence held until she spoke again. The rulings came in order and they came clean. The petition to freeze the assets was denied. The acquisition, the court found no cause to obstruct. Primary custody was awarded to Marcus, with a defined and regular visitation schedule for Lena. And on the software project, the court found it to be Marcus's separate property, developed with separate funds outside the shared time and shared knowledge of the marriage. Lena received an equitable share of the genuine marital estate. Nothing more. Marcus watched her receive the news without moving. She had organized everything in that first conference room, counted every card, timed every move, and she had been wrong about the one thing that mattered most, which was the nature of what she was dealing with. The only evidence of it was a stillness in her face that had not been there 90 days before. On the courthouse steps, Patrick Odom was waiting with his hands in his pockets. He offered his hand and Marcus took it. "You want to know what I was actually watching this morning?" Odom said. "Not the car, not the steps. I was watching your face when you got out. There are people who would have wanted to look at whoever was on those steps when they stepped out of that car. You didn't look at anyone." He let go. "You knew where you were going. That's the thing I can't teach." He turned up the collar of his coat against the Portland drizzle. "We'll get the paperwork together this week. Welcome to the other side of this." The deal closed 3 weeks later. Marcus did not post about it or mark the occasion in any particular way. What he did with the first real money was spend 2 weeks looking at houses in a neighborhood where Maisie could walk to school. And then he bought a small one with a yard that needed work and a porch that faced west and got the evening light. The first night in the house, he made dinner because dinner had carried him through the worst of it, and he was not going to stop now. He helped Maisie with a project about the water cycle at the kitchen table. He found the correct stuffed rabbit and installed it in the correct corner of the bed, and then when she was asleep and the house had gone quiet, he carried a cup of coffee out to the porch and sat with the evening, and let himself feel, for a little while, the particular weight of having come through something intact. He saw Lena at a school event 2 months after the move, a Thursday afternoon in a gymnasium with paper decorations and the specific organized chaos of children performing for the people who loved them. She was composed, still capable of filling a room, though there was something in her bearing that had not been there before, a quality that all the polish in the world could not quite cover. He had heard through the quiet channels these things travel that whatever had existed between her and Donovan Reese had not survived the exposure of what they had done together. He found that he felt nothing about it, which surprised him a little. They exchanged a few words near the back of the gymnasium about pickup times and a permission slip and a field trip in November. Civil, brief, the language of 2 people who shared a daughter, and not much else. When the program ended and the parents began collecting their children, Lena turned to go and then stopped and looked at him with an expression he could not fully read. "I didn't know how far along it was," she said, quietly, almost to herself. Marcus looked at her for a moment. There were things he could have said, things he had composed in his head during a dozen late nights when the unfairness of it had been sharpest and most available. "I know," he said. He crossed the gymnasium to where Maisie was waiting with a paper star that had come loose from her headband, and he crouched down and fixed it and took her hand, and they walked out of the building together into the ordinary November evening. There was no triumph in it. There was no score to settle, no point to make. There was only a man who had chosen patience when anger would have been easier, and silence when speech would have felt better, and who had in the end kept the one promise that had never been negotiable. His daughter's hand in his, and the both of them walking toward the car in the dark, and every birthday still ahead of them.